What's up, everybody? It's hard to believe, but in exactly 1 week, we are once again going on trial. And by we, I don't mean me and I don't mean you, hopefully. I mean Tracy Murphy. Tracy is the proprietor of a sanctuary called Oster's Farm Sanctuary in upstate New York. And after taking into her care two stray cows who wandered onto her property right next to her home, she's now facing larceny charges and potentially 1 year in jail and a trial that begins on October 3rd in exactly 1 week. And I thought this would be a good time to kind of do a blast in the past because we've gone through quite a few of these trials, and probably the one where the odds were worst for us, frankly, much worse than the odds that Tracy faces in this case, although she's also in an agricultural county. She's also in a county that has a lot of commercial agricultural interest and a lot of animal farming. The trial where we had probably the most uphill battle was a trial in southern Utah involving the rescue of two piglets, Lily and Lizzie, from a factory farm owned by Smithfield Foods. Smithfield is the single largest pork production company in the world. Their single largest factory farm is in Beaver County, Utah, southern Utah, in a county that is 90-10 Trump. 1/3 of the entire county works for Smithfield, and frankly, the other 2/3 work indirectly for Smithfield because the economy of the entire county is dependent on this one company. And when we were going to this case, my attorney, who was a very seasoned attorney who had previously worked for the government of Utah, told us the odds were hopeless and begged me to take a plea deal. But not only did we go to trial, we won. I was acquitted. And we won for reasons I'm going to get into shortly. But I thought now would be a good time to go watch that closing statement again and share with you some of the insights from how we won, because a lot of you are probably struggling with how to advocate for animals, how to talk about your veganism. And I think there's a lot for us to learn from what exactly happened in the trial. And the best way to learn about what happened in that trial is to watch the closing argument. And I've actually never seen this closing argument. For the record, I gave the closing argument, so that's not true. I guess I didn't see it. I heard it because they were my words. And I said before, and I'll say again, I don't think I was actually at my best. I mean, I think I was probably at like 10, 20% of my normal persuasive capacity. And I don't say that to toot my own horn and say, like, even when I suck, we still win. Because as you'll hear when I discuss the closing statement, I think the individuals who really won that case were Lily and Lizzie, the two piglets that, technically I was representing myself. Technically, they're two human defendants, but in my view, the real defendants were these two pigs. And the same is going to be true in Tracy Murphy's case, which technically she is the defendant, but really this is about the two cows she tried to help. And I think there's lessons in that for all of us, because one of the lessons from the Smithfield trial is don't center yourself. Don't make it about you. And too often we do when we get into arguments, even about social justice, even about animals who are being tortured. Not us. We're not the ones being tortured. Animals being tortured. We make it about us. We get defensive. We start getting emotional. We start feeling like people are attacking or judging us for being vegan or being animal advocates. And that's not a healthy approach. We have to make it about that. And that's one of the lessons we'll hear. But there are a lot of other lessons too. And frankly, I'm not even going to remember all the lessons until I watch the actual closing arguments. So we're going to watch it together. And I'm going to unpack both the law and some of the evidence and scientific research behind persuasion, what I'm trying to do in this closing argument that ended up being successful in persuading a conservative jury in Utah to defend the right to rescue. So you all ready? You all ready for this? So let's watch this video. There you all have my co-defendant, Paul Picklesheimer, in their wonderful suit. Paul definitely cleans up very well. And then you got my famous whiteboard with the 3 Ps. So one thing about this whiteboard and the words on this whiteboard, you see the words on this whiteboard are piglets, purpose, and price. And I talked in my opening statement about 3 Ps, and I talk about 3 Ps in my closing statement as well. And the main thing I want to say about this is it is incredibly useful to have mnemonic devices, just little tricks to help people remember what you're saying, because a lot of persuasion is just making sure you maintain people's attention and making sure they can actually recall what the heck you said. Because a lot of times, you probably heard the old mantra that to really persuade someone, you have to repeat the argument or repeat the message 7 times. Part of the reason for that is because they just don't remember. And so one trick in persuasion and any sort of oral advocacy, or frankly, written advocacy, is make sure your arguments are simple and memorable. And one way to make them simple and memorable is to have little mnemonic devices. And one of the things I said to the jury on the first day of the trial is, I'm going to talk to you about 3 Ps. You're going to hear evidence about 3 Ps: Piglets, purpose, and price. And if you remember these 3 Ps, you're going to remember why you have a duty to render a verdict of not guilty. Let's keep watching. So one thing about this, that sigh you hear, me going, that was a very, very authentic and legitimate sigh. And it was coming from 2 places. One was just sheer exhaustion, because in October 2022, when we litigated this case, I was completely overwhelmed, both with the number of cases that were coming down against us, the amount of work I had, the lack of sleep. And for the record, I had great attorneys working with me in the Utah case, and we got great attorneys working for Tracy in the Osh's Farm case. But it is grueling. And I have to say, one big difference between trials where we have succeeded and prevailed and the trials where we've lost is our support system is a lot better in the trials where we win. So, and this is a good lesson for all of us. If you have to make an important argument, make sure your support structure, your food, your sleep, just the basic physical support structure around you is good. Make sure you get good sleep the night before you have to make an argument. But even more important than that is the social support, because in Utah, I felt incredibly supported. The legal team was working in unity in an incredibly powerful way. And in some of these other cases in North Carolina and Sonoma County, things were a little more fraught. Like many of you know, in California, we literally had one of our co-defendants kind of turn on us, which wasn't the best situation. So one little piece of advice too, you see various bailiffs and staff members in the courtroom. When you're trying to persuade an audience, it is absolutely crucial to treat everyone, not just the people you're directly trying to persuade, but everyone around them with a lot of decency and respect. Because if you're getting a lot of negative feedback from people in the room, people act like other people. They tend to conform, even in subconscious and subtle ways, to the responses of other people in the room. In one of the ways we succeeded at winning over the jury was winning over the bailiff, winning over the courtroom staff, just being kind and friendly and generous to everyone around them. And when they smiled at us, when they made small gestures showing their kind of positive response to our arguments, it's hard for other people in the room, including the jurors, not to respond in the same way. And again, this is subtle, but it's important to treat everyone with respect, and don't treat anyone as beneath you, because everyone is deserving of your respect. And if you show that, then everyone in your room is more likely to be persuaded by the arguments you make.
Well, thank you all for bearing with us. It's been a long day. I'm sure you're incredibly tired, and I am. And I wish I could tell you the full story of what happened. We were on very direct orders to talk only about the night of March 7th, 2017, only about 2 piglets.
So a couple things that are interesting about this. One is, I actually forgot about this until just now. We ended up doing this closing argument, I think it was on a Friday night, and I was extremely concerned about that, because one thing about persuasion is if you're trying to persuade someone and they're hungry and they're tired and already feeling negative, it is very hard to persuade them. And we had the burden of persuasion. Technically, the prosecution had the burden of proof, but in this case, even when we did interviews of the jurors afterwards, they all said, we thought this case was open and shut from day one. I mean, they admitted they took the piglets. What is there to argue about? And so we effectively had the burden. And another thing to think about when you're trying to argue and persuade someone, even if it's a family member, a friend, make sure they're also getting their rest. They're getting their food and their water. And we actually begged the judge, can we actually do closing arguments on Monday? But the judge was very insistent. We're going to move forward. He actually asked the jury to come back and deliberate on a Saturday. I was acquitted on a Saturday, which is very unusual. And I was very concerned about that. And that's another one of the reasons I was tired, because we had an extremely long day. We actually almost had a mistrial declared on the last day of trial, because the prosecution basically tried to inject evidence into the case at the last stage that was totally inappropriate and had not been introduced in their original presentation of evidence. And I won't go into all the details here, but basically, when you call rebuttal witnesses, they call the veterinarian to rebut our veterinarian and claim the pigs are well treated, everything was fine, and so on. They actually introduced a bunch of evidence that we had never gotten a chance to cross-examine the witnesses on, and we didn't get a chance to tell our vet to respond to their vet. And so it was an extremely exhausting day. We got to the end of the day. The jury had been sitting around doing basically nothing, which is oftentimes doing nothing is the most exhausting thing because you're just anxious waiting for what's going to happen in this trial. And after hours and hours of the jury sitting around and waiting, I think it was around like 5 or 6 p.m. we have this closing argument. Not ideal conditions for persuasion.
But it's an interesting thing hearing someone as compelling as Vaughn, and he's a very compelling speaker, talk about what's in your heart in a way that you know is not true. And it's not.
So Vaughn Christensen was the county attorney for Beaver County, and there were multiple attorneys representing the state of Utah in this case. And he gave what I thought was a very good closing argument. Many of you may know Vaughn from the famous dented can episode. So during the Utah trial, he compared sick and dying piglets to a dented can and said, just as you can't steal a dented can from a grocery store, you cannot take a sick and dying piglet. This is something he said in response to my closing argument. So he hasn't made the infamous dented can comparison yet. This closing argument is what elicited that, I think, far-fetched comparison.
And honestly, the best way to explain it is the way Rick explained it, that there's a big difference between stealing an animal and trying to help someone who needs some help.
So this is a line given by a factory farmer himself named Rick Pittman. He's the owner of Pittman Family Farms. Despite the fact that he owns a business that slaughters millions of animals, he is someone I consider a personal friend, someone I like a lot. And so I'll just say there are 2 lessons from this. One is, don't treat every adversary as a permanent enemy, because an adversary could become an ally. And Rick has become an enormous ally, not just to me, but in my view, to the animal rights movement. And that showed in this trial, because in this trial, he testified on my behalf and said at the end of his testimony, under cross-examination, it was kind of amazing because he didn't even say this. And I'll tell you what he said in just a second. He didn't say this in response to my questioning. He said this in response to the cross-examination by the prosecution. In other words, the prosecution asked him a question that got the best line from the entire trial. And the line was this. The prosecution was trying to trap Rick and basically trick him into saying, whatever I think about Wayne, and I'll explain in a bit how Rick and I became friends. But whatever I think about Wayne, he did break into my farm. He did steal some turkeys from me. And that's how I came to know him. So he may be a good person, but he breaks the law. And when they were cross-examining him and saying, isn't it true that Mr. Hsiung broke into your turkey farm and stole some of your turkeys too, even though you're testifying on his behalf? What Rick said, and we did not really prepare him for this. He just, okay, we prepared him a little bit. We said it's going to come up at some point, but we didn't prepare this specific line. This is the line he came up with. He said, there's a big difference between stealing a turkey and helping someone who needs some help. And the latter is what Wayne did. He found some turkeys who needed some help, and he gave them some help. And that was the last line of the entire trial. And the funny thing is, we actually had more witnesses that we had planned, John Fromar and some other people. And we ended up not calling them because they thought, this is just too perfect. This is almost like a movie theater ending to the trial. And we thought our best chance of winning was just ending with that. And I brought back, Rick testified on Thursday. I brought back on Friday night Rick's closing line to the entire trial and said, I want to start this closing argument with what Rick shared with all of you, which is there's a big difference between stealing someone's stuff and giving help to someone who needs some help.
And I think at the end of this closing argument, we'll be convinced, hopefully, that that's all we're trying to do. But I did want to go back to where we started. In our opening statement, or I should say my opening statement, not our opening statement.
Whenever I said our, the prosecution would object and say, who's our? And I meant me and Paul because we're co-defendants. So you see me kind of joke a little bit about that because the prosecution was being, and I mean, there's some merit to their objection because you want to be specific in your testimony. But I just thought it was kind of funny that every time I would say our, the prosecution would object and say, who's our? It's like, well, I mean, you got the 2 co-defendants and I could say Paul and I every single time, but it's just easier to say our.
That we talked about how there were no piglets taken from gestation born. And we don't have to worry about that. Count one is done. We're not talking about gestation buildings. The prosecution's conceded, and the judge ruled that we don't have to do that charge.
So what happened with this first P? There were 3 P: piglets, purpose, and price. And in a nutshell, the argument I made, or not the argument, but the evidence I said they would be presented, by they I mean the jury, that the jury would be presented in my opening statement was, we're going to talk about how there are 3 things you need to know in this trial. First is you're going to need to know about the piglets. And specifically, the question you have to ask about your piglets is, did we take any piglets at all from the gestation born? And let me just explain what a gestation born is. There's 2 stages to raising piglets in a modern factory farm. The first is gestation, where the mother pig is pregnant, but the piglets haven't come out yet. They haven't been born. And the mother pig will live in a gestation barn for a few months. I think the normal gestation period, if I recall correctly, is about 100 days. And then they'll switch to a farrowing barn. And this is a completely different building. And the pigs actually have to walk from the gestation barn through a farrowing barn. And one of the saddest things about these horrible factory farms is the only time the mother pig come out of their crates is when they're going from one barn to the next to have their babies taken away from them, or immediately after their babies have been taken away from them. And that's horribly sad. But one of the bizarre things about this prosecution is the prosecution in Smithfield claimed we rescued piglets from a gestation barn. Why does that make no sense? Because those piglets in a gestation barn are still in their mom's belly. We couldn't have rescued them unless we performed some sort of weird surgery, which frankly, the prosecution borderline had some conspiracy theory style arguments that we took piglets from mother's womb. And we made the argument in trial, and we prevailed even before we got to closing argument, because the judge, who was not very fond of me, was not the sort of judge who liked me very much. And, I think still to this day, he was one of the more antagonistic judges I faced. Even the judge himself said, look, there's no evidence they took any piglets from a gestation barn.
But these 2 pieces are still very important. And the first piece is that we didn't have any purpose to take anything of value from Smithfield. We were there to document conditions and save lives if we saw a distressed animal.
So again, the second P was purpose. And in any criminal case, you have to prove not just what someone did, but what their intent was, why they did it. And in particular, in this case, what the prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt was that they had the intent to deprive someone of their property. And we argued our intent was not to deprive anyone of their property. Our intent was first and foremost to document the cruelty at Smithfield. But second, to the extent we had the intent to do anything with the piglets themselves, it was just to give aid to dying animals. And those dying animals had no value. They were not an attempt. They were removing the animals was not an attempt at theft. It was an attempt to save an animal who's on the brink of death.
This is important because it's an assessment of what's in our head and our hearts. And you heard testimony today from people who talked about what was on our minds and our hearts. You heard testimony yesterday about what was in our heads and our hearts. What you did not hear at any point during this trial was anyone, even the state's witnesses, saying that we had the intent to take anything of value. Uncontradicted over and over again. Statements we made back in 2017 and today. We felt that these animals were in dire medical need and they were on the brink of death. So state has made a lot of a transcript that you haven't been able to see the entire video of, where I say something along the lines of, if we see someone we can take out, we'll take them out.
You heard it in the beginning of my closing argument that I kind of wave my hand at the fact that we're very confined in what we can talk about. And then I say here, there's a transcript of a video that you have not been able to see. The prosecution moved in this case to literally exclude evidence of the video footage showing what we did. We had a 360-degree camera that showed everything we did inside this massive factory farm, including giving aid to these 2 piglets. And the prosecution excluded it entirely on the grounds that it was too gruesome and prejudicial, that it would sway the jury against the prosecution's case and therefore not permissible evidence. And it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen happen. Unfortunately, we've seen it happen in other animal rights and animal rescue cases where normally in a criminal case, the prosecution is begging and pleading to get video footage of what the defendant did into court. And the defendant's trying to exclude it, saying, you had an improper search warrant, or, the evidence was obtained in some other unconstitutional method. In this case, it was the opposite. We were begging and pleading to show the jury exactly what we did. And the prosecution was begging and pleading to get that out. And unfortunately, the judge ruled for the prosecution. And all the jury was able to see or hear from that video was a short transcript line where I talk about, before we actually go into the factory farm, if we see a piglet who's in need, we're going to give them some help.
I just remind you what I say shortly thereafter, and this is again a quote, is her face is covered in blood and she's down on the ground. She's not going to make it. And right after that, I say, there's a piglet who is starving to death.
Yeah, and this evidence shows what our intent was. Our intent was to help animals whose faces are covered with blood, who are starving to death. Our intent is not to steal anything of value. It's to give aid to sick and dying animals.
Lots of people have said that we took the pigs, including me. I've said that very openly in court. What I have not said, and what no one in this court has said, is that we intended to take a piglet who had any commercial value. I'll also point out that there's uncontradicted testimony that our training protocols, the investigations we do, and we've done for 10 years, require our team members only to take out animals who need medical care. There's a lot of good reasons for this, but the biggest one is when we take an animal out, it's because we feel like, as an act of mercy, they need help. Now, Dr. Sheriff did say that he saw piglets on the night of March 6th. What he did not say is he saw specifically Lily and Lizzie. And I can guarantee you, as the team lead and the only person responsible for identifying piglets who might have been taken out, when Dr. Sheriff is in a factory farm with 5,000 pigs and piglets, which is what Richard Topham testified, which is what Hsiung testified, he can't make out even one individual pig. So, on purpose, I think it's even true that Ms. McCannis stated that we published openly from day one what we did. And Ms. McCannis said that our story has been consistent throughout this entire time period. And it's important to note that one of the things we've been consistent about is that we did not intend to take a piglet out who had anything of value for Smithfield. So that's purpose. Let's move on to price. The instructions you were given indicated not only do you have to show, or not only does the state have to show, beyond a reasonable doubt that we intended to take something of value, but the piglets actually had to have it.
So there's legal nuances. There are two elements to the theft and burglary prosecution against us in Smithfield. One is that we had the intent to take something of value. And second is that the animals had to actually have some value. And we could prevail on either of those elements. And in a criminal case, the key thing is if there is any doubt, any reasonable doubt about any of the elements of the offense that the prosecution has to prove, a jury in theory is supposed to render a verdict of not guilty. Now, the reality is, if you look at actually how criminal cases operate, that just does not happen. There are so many cases, including this case, in my view, where the burden of proof is effectively placed on the defendant. We had to prove we were innocent. They didn't have to prove we were guilty. And that was true of this case. But one of the things you do as a courtroom lawyer, and I actually am not entirely sure how important this is, but it's been drilled into my head and it's drilled into every criminal defense's head that it's important to do, is emphasize that it is better, this presumption of innocence. It is better for one guilty man to go free, or for 1,000 guilty men to go free, than for one innocent person to be put in jail. And that's one of the basic principles of the American criminal legal system. And it's a principle that favors defendants, so we try to bring it up in court.
Just to reiterate some of the evidence you heard to show that these piglets did not have any fair market price or any value by which any reasonable buyer would purchase them. Among other things, the hundreds of dollars spent giving these piglets veterinary care. Dr. Schertz's Rosenberg's testimony, having consulted with the caretakers back in 2017 when the animals were taken out, and again in 2022 in preparation for this testimony. And her opinion didn't change. She asked to do the same thing. She said the same things are wrong with pigs.
Yeah, so one incredibly important thing in all these cases is expert opinions. And an expert opinion is an opinion on something that is based on experience, scientific training, and scientific evidence. And it was incredibly important to us in this case. We had an expert saying these piglets had no commercial value. So saying that when I looked at the condition they're in, I believe the defendants when they said they spent hundreds of dollars in keeping these animals alive. And very importantly in this case, and I think I'm about to make this argument in closing, is it wasn't just our vet. Even Smithfield's vet conceded that these piglets were in dire medical condition and it would cost at least hundreds of dollars to care for each of them. And in the face of the prosecution claiming the piglets were only worth $40 each, the fact that their own expert witness testified that it would cost hundreds of dollars to keep these animals alive was very compelling evidence to the jury that we were innocent of the crime.
And then finally, the photographic and videographic evidence you saw yourself before. You saw diarrhea, and I encourage you to go back and watch that video and check for yourself. Is that diarrhea vertical or is it horizontal? Is it spraying out horizontally in an explosive fashion, or is it just going down straight to the ground?
So the famous explosive diarrhea video. The prosecution in court did not allow us to show a lot of evidence of the condition of the pigs at Smithfield Farms or Smithfield Foods. They did allow us to show a tiny amount of video footage of the post-rescue care given to the animals. And we showed a video, and maybe we'll even splice this into this video so you can see, although it's a little disgusting, of the horizontal splatter of the diarrhea. And the reason this is important is because vertical diarrhea, diarrhea that comes out of the butt and just goes straight down, that's not explosive diarrhea, is less suggestive of very dangerous infections than explosive diarrhea. And so we showed video footage and we had a vet testifying about how the splatter pattern of the diarrhea in the video footage was horizontal, showing that these piglets not only had diarrhea, but they had explosive horizontal diarrhea.
We showed evidence of the animal's body. I encourage you to look at the exhibit of me stepping in the crib. Look at the little piglet behind the bar. Compare her size to the others. And remember what Dr. Hsiung Rosenberg told you, that body weight is the #1 factor in piglet mortality.
So we weren't allowed to show a lot of video or photos, as I said, but we were allowed to show one screenshot from the video. I think this is the only screenshot from the video of the actual rescue that we were allowed to show that just showed Lily's size compared to the other piglets. And we'll throw that into this video too, so you can see for yourself. How big is Lily compared to the other piglets? And if she was little, that meant she was a runt. And if she was a runt, then odds are she was never going to make it to slaughter. Workers were going to grab her by her hind legs and smash her skull against the concrete or throw into a CO2 box and gas her to death. And that meant she didn't have any value, right? Her price, her value would be zero. And therefore, the jury has to render a verdict of not guilty.
If these piglets were a third or a fourth the size of the normal weight, imagine a fully grown adult human being who's 40 or 50 pounds. This is roughly the equivalent of what Lily and Lizzie were facing on that night.
It's funny, I watched this video and I just think I'm so ineffective. This is what I was saying when I said I was like 10 or 20% at my best, because there are times where you're giving a presentation, even the presentation I'm giving to you all today would have been so much better than what I gave in October of 2022. But some of these very limited samples, the photos and videos of Lily and Lizzie, where we weren't allowed to get in much. What we got in was enough to persuade the jury, because I definitely was not at my best. I was tired. You know, there are times when you're giving a speech and you can just tell you're connecting with the audience. There's just like this weird emotional synergy unfolding in the room. And this sometimes, I mean, it happens most when you're with a friendly audience. You know, I'm a vegan. Hopefully you're a vegan. If you're not, go vegan. Why are you even watching this video if you're not? No, I'm kidding. If you're not vegan, I still love you and I'm glad you're watching this. But there are times when you give a speech or even you play some music. I haven't played a lot of music in my life, but I have played some music. I used to play piano and saxophone a long time ago. And there are times when you can just tell the room is on the same emotional wavelength. And this was not one of those times. And one of the most important things you need to do to get to that place is be very present. You can't be thinking about whatever's in your own head. You can't be going through anxiety or doubts. And I was just so tired and worn down during this trial, I wasn't present the way I needed to be in order to give an effective oral argument. Or I should say, in order to give an optimally effective oral argument. This is not a bad oral argument. I mean, we won, but it definitely wasn't the most effective.
And then there is the term, I think it's hypogalactia, preventing Lizzie from nursing on her mother's teats, like the ripped up and tattered nipples that we've not been able to see.
Hypogalactia, fancy term for decreased milk production as a result of a mother's teat being shredded. And we weren't actually able to show, from what I recall, the photos or videos of hypogalactia. In this case, the hypogalactia was caused because the mothers were facing so much competition in their teats. Essentially, what happens is these mother pigs have, 12 or so teats. depending on the breed of pig. I forget how many there were. I think they're probably 12 because they're Yorkshire breed pigs, and I think Yorkshires normally have 12 piglets. But it depends a lot on the breed, and there's been a lot of weird genetic manipulation of the animals to make them have more teats. But the mother pigs will often have more piglets than they have teats, and that means that piglets have to fight for each teat. And when two piglets are fighting for a teat, it often leads to injuries on the teats. And over time, these teats can be shredded to the point they look like some sort of vampire octopus, like bloody, shredded tendrils instead of like an intact teat. And partly for that reason, there's no milk production because the teat's been shredded. And when there's no milk production, little baby pigs not only have covered with blood because they're trying to get milk and they can't, they're literally drinking blood, but they also become runts because they're not getting enough nutrition.
There was this serious foot injury on Lily's foot. And even Dr. Dean Taylor conceded, the state's vet, who is part of an organization whose mission is to promote animal agriculture in the state. Even he considered an x-ray alone would cost $60. That an examination for Lily alone would cost $100. That is a lot more than $40.20.
So this is what I was talking about, where even the state's vet said these animals would cost hundreds of dollars to save, and they're claiming the animals are each worth $40. Well, that money is going to be all lost in veterinary fees. And so the animals have no value. The other thing to say about this, though, that's kind of valuable for anyone engaged in any sort of persuasive advocacy is relying on unexpected allies is very valuable. Too often when we trot out the same vegan celebrities and influencers, Joaquin Phoenix, Earthling Ed, Ellen DeGeneres, I mean, whoever it is, Ingrid Newkirk, that's not persuasive to someone because they expect all those people to say good things about veganism and animal rights. What's a lot more surprising is when you find people who you don't expect to support veganism and animal rights to say good things. So, for example, every time Joe Rogan says something good about animals, you should emphasize that. And if you didn't know this, I'm going to give you a line that you can use. Here's the line. Joe Rogan himself has said that factory farming is so abominable. If he did not hunt, he would feel a moral obligation to go vegan. Now, we all know that's nonsense because hunting is a violent, cruel practice. And no offense to all you hunters, but actually kind of offense to all the hunters because you all should stop. But the point is the fact that even a hunter who is on essentially a carnivore diet is saying the conditions in factory farms are so awful that we have to go vegan is really compelling, persuasive evidence because it's unexpected. You don't expect someone from that walk of life endorsing the vegan lifestyle. And that's something you should use as well. Try and get unexpected allies to support your position, whether it's on animal rights or another issue.
But also there's just Smithfield itself. This is a company that did not even realize these piglets were gone. If these piglets really did have some value, commercial or otherwise, for the company, why is it they didn't even realize these piglets were gone until months later when something was published in the New York Times? And the reason is, piglets are going to be discarded, thrown in the garbage, don't have value. So I just want to respond to a couple things that Mr. Christensen said. One was Paul's role. Mr. Christensen thinks that I'm just trying to cover it all. I testified very openly, and I've stated this from the beginning, back in 2017 today. There's been nothing changing about my story, as Ms. McCannis herself has acknowledged, that Paul's role was the videographer.
Yeah, one of the most stressful things to me about this case that was not true of Sonoma County or North Carolina was the fact that I had a co-defendant. It wasn't just me. And, you know, not only do I have a co-defendant, but I know my co-defendant's mom. Elaine Picklesheimer is an amazing human being. She's been so supportive of our work for so many years. And I knew how hurt she would be if her son went to prison. And we were facing, at the start of this trial, at the start of this case, potentially 60 years. It got down to 10 before the trial. And after the judge dismissed the burglary count and the gestation crate barn, it was down to 5 years. But our understanding was Smithfield was going to ask for 5 years. And I think the judge probably would have given them something like that. I don't know exactly what, but you know, Smithfield wanted to come down hard. It was very, very stressful for me to think about not just my own well-being and interest, but a good friend's and someone I knew whose family would be very adversely affected by their incarceration. So, yeah, it's weird though, but part of me thinks that it was good pressure for me because the fact that I felt that pressure and stress made me probably better than I otherwise would have been, because in the cases where it was just me, honestly, I haven't felt nearly as much pressure. And I'm not entirely sure why it's the case. I think it's partly because I just believed and still believe, and now have had experience in jail to suggest jail is not that bad for me. I mean, it's an awful experience and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but it wasn't that bad for me. It may say something weirder about my psychology, though. The fact that I seem to be not that concerned about the outcomes in cases where I'm a defendant.
You saw that in even the transcript that Mr. Christensen read to you. You saw that in all the photos and videos. It's just the truth. Paul did not touch a piglet, he did not move a piglet, and he cannot be held responsible for anything that I did.
So I just realized, I think what I said there is not entirely accurate. He didn't remove a piglet, but he did touch piglets at times, and he did apparently hold a piglet at times. But that evidence didn't come out at trial, and I think I honestly wasn't even sure of it. I don't think I ever saw the video footage, but I think Paul told me about this. Not that it ultimately affected, even if the jury had known this, because I admitted I touched lots of piglets. I was grabbing piglets and taking them out of the factory farm. But one of our arguments, I thought going into this case that there was a very good chance Paul would be acquitted. I thought the case was mostly hopeless for me. But given that Paul's role was mostly just an investigator, you can't charge someone for burglary and theft because they shot video footage with a camera, right? And that's mostly what Paul was doing.
I also want to say a little bit more about Andrew in March 6th. So it was under my impression that we're not supposed to talk about anything that happened before the night of March 7th. Andrew did talk about that. When Andrew talked about March 6th, he said, I saw thousands of piglets. I saw thousands of animals. He did not mean, and I don't think he's a lawyer, he's not a perfect speaker, that he saw these specific individual piglets on them.
So this is a little complicated, but what happened at trial was Dr. Andrew Shero, a good friend of mine who I'm actually unfortunately no longer able to speak to as a result of the Sonoma County conviction. He's a PhD in biophysics from UC Berkeley. Great guy, really smart, and one of our team members. When he was being cross-examined, we were talking about the events of March 7th, 2017, where we rescued 2 piglets. And I think the question he was asked of the prosecution in cross-examination was this the first time you saw piglets at Smithfield? And he said the first time that night, right? And that opened the door for him to be asked questions about what happened on the nights before. And we had actually been back to Smithfield Farms, or Smithfield Foods, many times before. Before we did the rescue, we'd done this longer-term investigation, even going back to January of 2017. But the jury hadn't heard any of this. So the first time they heard that we had been there before. And I was in the impression, this is actually completely true, what I say in this closing argument, that we weren't allowed to talk about it because the judge excluded all that evidence on the grounds that on those prior occasions, you were not accused of burglary and theft. You were there to document, and you documented, but you can't talk about all the cruelty you found, about the gestation crates you found, contrary to the company's public statements that we got rid of gestation crates, because it's all too prejudicial. So we were excluded from talking about what happened before March 7th, 2017. But then in cross-examination, the prosecution got to talk about it. And it made the jury, and we interviewed the jurors afterwards, and we know this, the jury lost some trust in us. They thought we had been trying to hide the fact that we had been there previously. But the key legal point the prosecution was trying to make was that, well, if Andrew had been there the night before and saw these 2 specific piglets, then on March 7th, if you had seen them on March 6th, you came back to rescue the 2 piglets you saw. And that shows you had the intent to remove animals. That your intent that day was not to document, it was to steal piglets. And in fact, that was not true because Andrew did not see these 2 specific piglets. I honestly don't even think we were in the same barn. And the reality is the jury never should have been presented with that evidence anyways, because the judge excluded all the pre-March 7th, 2017 evidence from the courtroom. And it just came out by happenstance during cross-examination. But it just shows you that wild stuff happens at trial, and you've got to make lemonade out of lemons.
But say that he did see. Say that he did see Lily and Lizzie, and he said to himself, let's take them out tomorrow. That doesn't change the fact that both of these animals were in dire medical need. So even if you don't agree with me about some of these things, even if you think I might be wrong about some of these things factually, if you have a reasonable doubt, a single reasonable doubt on any of these issues, on purpose or price, if you think it's possible these animals were so sick they didn't have any commercial value, you have a legal duty to render a verdict of not guilty. Now you might be concerned about that and say, how can we let people just run into companies in the middle of the night? And I can understand that concern. That's a legitimate concern. But I want to say to you again that there are other ways to approach that concern. For one, these companies could actually respond to our entreaties to create change. The government authorities could respond to the animal cruelty complaints. Or the prosecution could charge us with a crime that's actually suitable to this offense, like trespass. Those things didn't happen. And regardless of whether you think those things should or should not happen, the question facing you is not whether you agree with our actions. It's legitimate to disagree, and many people in this courtroom, I'm sure, do disagree. The question is whether the elements of the crimes that have been charged, burglary and theft, fit the actions that were undertaken on that night. But I'm going to do something a little strange again. I know there have been a lot of strange things unfolding in this trial, and say that I don't actually really want you to quit us.
So this line was extremely controversial within our legal team. and I really believed it and I liked it. But basically I said, I don't want you to quit us just because you think we didn't commit the crime. And I want you to quit us because you agree with us from a moral perspective as an act of conscience. And I really shouldn't interrupt. I'll just let you listen to the argument.
On a technical legal issue. I'm actually hoping to make a decision of conscience. I'm going to come back to the words where Piglets said, the farmer, that there's a big difference between stealing an animal and rescuing someone who needs some help. If you defend our right to give aid to dying animals, defend the right of all citizens to aid dying and sick and injured animals, there's some things that will happen in this world. Companies will be a little more compassionate to the creatures under their stewardship. Governments will be a little more open to animal cruelty complaints. And maybe, just maybe, a baby pig like Lily won't have to starve to death on the floor of a factory farm. The animals of this earth have given us so much. Maybe you probably know this yourself. They've given us food. They've given us clothing. They've given us their love. If you have a dog and a cat in your home, as I do.
That was super controversial when you say they've given us their food, they've given us clothing. For obvious reasons, because these things weren't given, they were violently taken, right? And I thought about whether I should stick to this, because especially since I think one of the things I've learned is it's really important to be authentic in these cases. And you know, there were some like technical reasons I could defend those statements. Like, for example, you know, when we talk about food and clothing, it is true that animals have given us food. So, for example, my mom gave me milk when I was a little baby, but that's not what I mean, obviously. So it's a technically correct statement and technically ethical statement that is not going to be interpreted that way. And I think the way I got to the point where I could justify it and justify this point, and this point is, I think, where I tried to show the jury that even if you see me as an animal rights and vegan radical, there's a lot connected to us, is this, that even though we cause the animals so much suffering and violence, even though we've subjected these animals to captivity and cages and facilities that can only be described as concentration camps, one of the most disturbing things about this entire system is, in many ways, the animals still love us. They still come towards us. They still are willing to give of themselves everything they have for us, because that is the product of domestication. Many of you have probably seen a dog or a cat who is abused, who, for whatever reason, still trusts human beings, doesn't bite, doesn't lash out. Some of you may have even adopted an animal like that who has suffered enormous abuse and yet still comes and gives us kindness and love and trusts us with everything. And in many ways, that's the plight of every animal in a factory farm or slaughterhouse, that even though they have no reason to trust us, they still give to us everything, including their own bodies, their lives. And so that's the way I was justifying in my own head. And maybe that's not a good justification. Maybe the argument is still a little too cute. And I'd certainly be interested in your feedback on this. But that's the way I got to the point where I kind of accepted that line.
All they've asked for us in return is to be good stewards of their welfare. To recognize what Rick Pittman recognized, that we all have a duty to be kind. And your decision today, if you make a good one, will make the world a little bit of a kinder place. even for a baby pig in a factory farm. Thank you very much.
Your decision today, if you make the right one, will make the world a tiny bit more kind, even for a tiny pig in a factory farm. Yeah, I didn't deliver it very well, and I didn't deliver it that well then. I mean, I've definitely given better speeches in my life. But, and honestly, I wasn't sure what to make of the jury. I will say this, I thought they were very, very attentive to every word. And in many ways, that's all you can ask for. And that has been a difference between the cases where we've won and we've lost. It does feel like in the cases we've won, part of what we've achieved is just seizing the attention of the jury in a way that North Carolina or in Sonoma County in California, it felt like the jury was looking away from me during my closing argument. That definitely wasn't true in Utah. Every word I said was being listened to very carefully by every one of the jurors, and I'm grateful to them for that. So that's it. What are some of the big picture lessons for everyone in terms of persuasion and how to communicate about animals? The first is don't hide the ball. I think that one of the things I learned in this case is our biggest mistakes in this case and in prior cases where we tried to be a little too cute. You know, the Dr. Andrew Scherer testimony where we didn't disclose the fact that we'd been there before, that was partly a result of the judicial rulings. But to be honest, even our internal legal team said, like, no, let's not talk about all the other times we've come there, because if people find out you've been there not just once, but repeatedly, you keep coming back and back and back again and again and again, they're going to want you to stop at some point and say, when does it end? And I think we listened to that argument a little too much instead of saying, no, we got to own what we did and don't hide the ball. Show them exactly what we did and explain it to them. And if we think the explanation is a good one, if we think there is a real justification to our actions, then just share it with the jury directly. But the other way in which we didn't hide the ball is, even with that closing argument, you'll notice that the argument I made is not really much about the law. I said, if you make the right choice today, there's a little pig out there who isn't going to have to starve to death on the floor of a factory farm. The world will become a little more kind. And that's not a legal argument. That's mostly an argument of conscience. And some of our other cases, we haven't led with our hearts in the way we led with our heart in this case. And even though, you know, I was, again, 10% capacity, really not my best in terms of closing arguments, not my best in terms of oral advocacy, I think the fact that we led with our hearts and we didn't hide the ball was really important. Okay. So that's one of the lessons. Don't hide the ball. Show the world exactly what you believe and exactly who you are. Another one of the arguments, though, is, you know, you've got to over-prepare. And I think that one of the reasons the jury ultimately trusted us in this case in Merced, which we also won, in Ridgeland, where we didn't get to go to trial, but we were on our way to winning, was just the degree of preparation we had. And one of my old mentors, Cass Sunstein, he's the most cited law professor in the country. He's been arguably more persuasive than any other lawyer or legal academic in the last 50 years. Certainly more people have cited his papers than any legal academic or lawyer in the last 50 years. And don't get me wrong, Cass is a very smart, persuasive guy. But one of the things he showed me is the importance of the details, the importance of diving deep. I remember Cass was giving a presentation about capital punishment. And it was a controversial presentation because he was defending the death penalty in a context, a society, a legal profession where not many people are very sympathetic to the death penalty among law professors. And Cass himself is a liberal. I mean, he was good buddies with Barack Obama, ended up being appointed to head up the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs under Obama. And Cass is a liberal, and he's saying, no, I think there's an argument for the death penalty. And I won't go into the details. He wrote a piece with Adrian Vermeule about why the death penalty might be justified in certain contexts. But one of the reasons he was very persuasive in making this argument when he was giving talks around the country about capital punishment was he really understood the details in a finely grained way. It was shocking to a lot of the people who are in audiences when they asked them questions. They'd say something, and then Cass would cite, for example, the exact number of people who have been executed in Kansas in 1973. And there's something about that extensive preparation, the deep knowledge of specific details that just earned a lot of trust in his audiences. People felt like, oh, whatever I think about capital punishment, the person who's really educated on this issue is Cass. And it's because he did the homework. And I think that's a lesson for us all. Part of what we need to learn is not just what the most clever arguments is, how to have confidence, how to package the argument most effectively, but we just need more ammunition. We need more memory in the bank. Partly because everyone who we talk to may need a different argument, but partly because the more we have retained, the more we can just off the cuff state, for example, that 18% of piglets die on factory farms even before they reach slaughter, or the fact that the routine methods of slaughtering piglets on factory farms include gassing and thumping, the smashing of pigs' skulls on concrete. The more we can bring these vivid details, these facts, to a conversation immediately due to our preparations, the more likely it is that people have confidence that our argument is right. Maybe the last and most important lesson in all this, though, is just to have faith. And it's kind of a funny thing to say because, I'm an agnostic or atheist myself. And faith is something that is not very popular in the world today. We like to think my beliefs are based on argument. My beliefs are based on evidence. I don't believe in faith. But there's a funny thing about faith and the way it shapes the arguments and the evidence you have, that when you really believe in what you're saying and you believe in your case, when you believe that a better world is actually possible, and not just possible, but inevitable. And I think this is one of my superpowers as an activist and as an advocate. I've always believed, from almost the day I read Animal Liberation to today, 20 some years later, when I read that first sentence of Animal Liberation, this is a book about the tyranny of human over non-human animals. It took me about a day to process, but after reading that book, reading that line, looking through the arguments, looking at the evidence in Animal Liberation, I concluded that animal rights is not just possible. It's not just likely. It is inevitable. That we're living in a society and system that is essentially a house of cards that will fall apart on the weight of its own hypocrisy over time. And I think you can see that in the arguments I make. And so I'd just encourage all of you to find not just your hope, not just your confidence, but your absolute, utter conviction that the animal rights movement will win. Because when we started doing these cases, everyone around me, I talked to some of the leaders in the animal rights movement, said, you can't do this. You're not going to win any of these cases. You're going to go to prison for a long time. It'll undermine your activism. And when we won in Utah, it was a resounding symbol, a resounding demonstration of the power of the message of animal rights. And if you have faith, you'll have that power too. Okay. I think that's all I had to say. So again, we're going to trial in a week, different facts, different county, different state. And I'm honestly also feeling very tired, but for different reasons. But one thing that's true in this case, in all of our cases, is I have faith. I have faith in our defendant. I think our defendant is a tremendous and profoundly good human being who's spent so much of her life helping animals and is still devoting so much of her time, her life, her freedom to the animals. I think we have very good legal and factual arguments, but maybe more important than anything is the fact that I just have faith that you and me and other people around this world see that animals are not things. They're living beings who deserve love. And if we have that faith, we can change the world and win some criminal cases in the process. So anyway, stay tuned for a lot more. You are going to hear more about this case, both on this podcast, on YouTube, and on my Instagram and Twitter. We definitely need all the support you can get, so please follow. But until next time, have faith. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Dad. Here we go.
Poor sweetheart, your little foot hurts.
We don't have to hurt animals. We can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.